For centuries, nations were defined by borders, armies, and governments, yet today a different kind of power is quietly reshaping the global order. Corporations that once operated within countries are beginning to resemble entities with influence comparable to states themselves. They control vast digital platforms, global supply chains, financial networks, and even communication infrastructure that billions of people rely on daily. This shift has led some analysts to describe the phenomenon as corporate nations, a system where private institutions accumulate authority once reserved for governments. Unlike traditional empires, this power does not expand through conquest, but through data, capital, and technological ecosystems that bind users and economies together. Companies influence labor markets, shape cultural narratives, and negotiate directly with policymakers across multiple countries simultaneously. As digital platforms grow larger, they begin setting rules that resemble governance, determining who can participate, what content is visible, and how transactions occur. This evolving landscape raises questions about sovereignty and accountability. When a corporation operates across borders with revenue exceeding the GDP of smaller nations, its decisions carry geopolitical weight. Governments still hold legal authority, yet enforcement becomes complex when economic dependence grows. Critics argue this resembles a modern form of feudalism, where power concentrates in a few institutions that provide services in exchange for loyalty and participation. Supporters counter that corporate scale drives innovation and efficiency, creating opportunities that traditional structures cannot match. The debate is not simply ideological, it reflects a deeper transformation in how power organizes itself in a globalized economy. Understanding the rise of corporate nations requires looking beyond headlines toward the systems shaping everyday life. These systems do not announce themselves as governments, yet their influence increasingly determines how individuals work, communicate, and consume across borders. What looks like innovation on the surface may be quietly redefining who truly governs the digital and economic world today. The idea of corporate nations did not emerge suddenly. It developed gradually as globalization reshaped how businesses operate across borders. During earlier industrial eras, corporations depended heavily on the countries where they were founded, but digital transformation changed this relationship. Technology platforms allowed companies to scale globally without building traditional physical infrastructure in every region. Cloud computing, cross-border payments, and data-driven logistics reduced dependence on local markets, enabling firms to operate almost like independent ecosystems. As these ecosystems expanded, corporations began negotiating directly with governments over taxation, regulation, and labor standards. Some gained leverage by threatening to relocate operations or limit services, forcing policymakers to balance economic growth against regulatory control. This dynamic resembles historical feudal relationships, where powerful entities bargained with rulers for autonomy in exchange for resources or stability. The difference today lies in speed and scale. Decisions made by a single company can instantly affect millions of workers and consumers across continents. Platforms create rules that function like private law, shaping interactions without democratic oversight. Terms of service agreements replace public legislation in many digital spaces, influencing behavior through algorithms rather than elections. At the same time, companies invest heavily in infrastructure such as data centers, logistics networks, and financial services that resemble public utilities. Governments often rely on these systems to deliver digital services, further blurring the boundary between public and private authority. This evolution challenges traditional definitions of sovereignty. States remain powerful, yet they increasingly share influence with entities that operate beyond national borders. The rise of corporate nations is therefore not simply about corporate greed or political failure. It reflects structural shifts in how economic power organizes itself. Understanding this transition requires recognizing that globalization has moved beyond trade into governance itself. As corporations become platforms rather than companies, their role begins to resemble the infrastructure once controlled exclusively by states. One of the defining characteristics of corporate nations is their control over digital territory rather than physical land. In the past, sovereignty depended on geography, but today platforms create virtual spaces where billions of people interact daily. Social media networks, online marketplaces, and payment ecosystems function like digital cities with their own rules, incentives, and hierarchies. Users accept terms of service that outline acceptable behavior, dispute resolution processes, and penalties, effectively agreeing to a form of private governance. Algorithms act as regulators, deciding which voices are amplified or suppressed, which products gain visibility, and which economic activities succeed. This shift transforms power into something less visible but equally influential. A platform's decision to change an algorithm can reshape entire industries overnight, affecting creators, businesses, and even political discourse. Unlike traditional governments, corporations operate globally, while legal systems remain national, creating gaps in oversight. These gaps allow platforms to adapt faster than regulators can respond. Critics argue that this concentration of authority mirrors feudal structures, where lords controlled territories and offered protection or opportunity in exchange for loyalty. Today, loyalty takes the form of user engagement, data sharing, and platform dependence. Yet the analogy is imperfect. Digital platforms also enable unprecedented access to markets and information, empowering individuals in ways older systems never could. The tension lies in balancing innovation with accountability. When digital spaces become central to economic and social life, questions arise about who sets the rules and whose interests they serve. Corporate nations do not claim sovereignty explicitly, but their influence shapes daily behavior at a scale once reserved for governments. The boundaries between participation and dependence become increasingly blurred as more aspects of life move online. Digital territory may lack borders, but its invisible rules increasingly define how modern societies function and who benefits from participation. Financial power represents another pillar of corporate nations, transforming companies into entities capable of influencing global economies in ways that resemble sovereign actors. Technology firms and multinational platforms increasingly operate payment systems, digital wallets, and financial infrastructure that move billions of dollars across borders daily. These systems reduce reliance on traditional banking networks and allow corporations to shape how transactions occur, what fees apply, and which users gain access. In some regions, digital payment platforms have become more trusted than public financial institutions, giving companies indirect influence over monetary behavior. This shift echoes historical moments when merchant guilds or trading companies accumulated authority by controlling commerce routes. Today, data replaces ships and ports as the main driver of economic power. Corporations analyze spending patterns, manage advertising ecosystems, and influence credit decisions through algorithms, effectively acting as financial intermediaries. Governments remain responsible for regulation, but enforcement becomes challenging when services operate globally through decentralized networks. The emergence of corporate-backed digital currencies and payment ecosystems raises further questions about sovereignty. If private platforms manage large portions of financial flows, they gain leverage over policy discussions related to taxation, privacy, and competition. Supporters argue that innovation increases efficiency and financial inclusion, especially in regions underserved by traditional banks. Critics warn that concentrating financial infrastructure in corporate hands creates systemic risks, particularly when decision-making prioritizes shareholder interests. The comparison to feudalism becomes clearer when economic access depends on remaining within certain ecosystems. Users rely on platforms for income, advertising, and transactions, creating networks of dependency that extend beyond national boundaries. Financial infrastructure, therefore, becomes a form of soft governance, shaping incentives without direct political authority. Understanding this layer reveals how corporate nations expand influence not only through technology, but through control over the economic flows that sustain modern societies. When financial systems shift into private ecosystems, economic power begins moving quietly away from traditional public institutions. Labor dynamics further illustrate how corporate nations resemble a modern form of feudalism, particularly through the rise of platform-based employment. Gig economy companies, digital marketplaces, and remote work platforms connect workers to global opportunities, yet they also redefine traditional employment relationships. Instead of long-term contracts with clear protections, many workers operate as independent contractors governed by platform rules and algorithms. These rules determine visibility, payment structures, and even job access, creating systems where loyalty to a platform can influence income stability. Unlike historical feudal systems tied to land ownership, today's digital hierarchies revolve around data and reputation scores. Workers build ratings that function like social capital, encouraging continuous participation to maintain standing within the ecosystem. This structure offers flexibility but also introduces uncertainty, particularly during economic downturns, when algorithmic changes can reduce earnings without negotiation. Companies benefit from scalability because they avoid the costs associated with permanent employment, while workers assume greater risk individually. Governments attempt to adapt labor laws to this evolving reality, yet regulatory frameworks often lag behind innovation. The result is a hybrid labor market that blends autonomy with dependence. Some individuals thrive in this environment, gaining access to international clients and new income streams, while others struggle with inconsistent wages and limited benefits. The comparison to feudalism emerges from the balance of power. Platforms provide opportunity and infrastructure, but participation often requires adherence to rules set unilaterally by corporate actors. This raises questions about fairness, representation, and long-term economic security. Corporate nations do not directly govern workers, yet they influence livelihoods through systems that resemble private labor ecosystems. Understanding these dynamics reveals how employment itself is being reshaped by digital platforms, blurring the boundary between empowerment and control. When work depends on algorithms instead of contracts, the structure of power becomes less visible yet more deeply embedded in everyday life. Another dimension of corporate nations appears in their influence over information and cultural narratives, shaping public discourse in ways once dominated by traditional institutions. Digital platforms determine which news spreads widely, which creators gain visibility, and which communities grow or fade through algorithmic design. These systems prioritize engagement metrics that often favor emotionally charged content, subtly influencing how societies understand politics, economics, and social issues. Unlike public broadcasters or national media outlets bound by specific regulations, global platforms operate across jurisdictions with varying standards. This allows companies to set moderation policies that function like private governance over speech. Supporters argue that centralized platforms help manage misinformation and create shared spaces for communication, while critics warn that concentrating information power in corporate hands can distort democratic processes. The scale of influence is unprecedented. A single policy update can reshape global conversations overnight, affecting elections, markets, and cultural trends. Governments attempt to regulate content moderation, yet enforcement varies widely, leading to ongoing debates about free expression and corporate responsibility. In many ways, these platforms resemble medieval lords, controlling access to knowledge through patronage systems, where visibility becomes a form of currency. Creators adapt their behavior to align with algorithmic incentives, reinforcing platform norms even without explicit enforcement. This dynamic illustrates how corporate nations shape not only economic activity, but also the narratives that define public reality. As more communication shifts online, the boundary between private platform decisions and public governance becomes increasingly blurred. Information ecosystems now influence trust, identity, and social cohesion at a global scale. Understanding this layer highlights how power evolves when communication infrastructure moves into private hands, redefining who sets the agenda for public debate. Control over information may be the most subtle form of power, shaping perception long before policy decisions ever appear. Corporate nations also expand influence through infrastructure that increasingly resembles public utilities, particularly in cloud computing, logistics, and data storage. Major technology firms operate global networks that host government services, business operations, and everyday digital tools used by billions of people. Instead of relying solely on national infrastructure, many countries depend on privately owned data centers and platforms to deliver essential online services. This shift reduces costs and accelerates innovation, but it also creates new dependencies. When critical infrastructure belongs to corporate ecosystems, decisions about pricing, security, and access gain geopolitical significance. Cloud providers negotiate directly with governments, shaping how data is stored and protected across borders. Logistics platforms optimize global supply chains, determining which goods move efficiently and which regions face delays. These systems resemble modern trade routes, controlled by powerful entities rather than neutral infrastructure. Supporters argue that corporate efficiency allows rapid technological progress that public institutions alone could not achieve. Critics warn that concentrating infrastructure in a few companies creates vulnerabilities, particularly during cyber incidents or political disputes. The comparison to feudalism emerges through the concept of protection. Just as medieval lords offered security in exchange for allegiance, modern platforms offer scalability and reliability while encouraging long-term reliance on their ecosystems. Businesses and governments invest deeply in these systems, making exit costly and complex. Over time, infrastructure becomes a form of leverage, influencing policy discussions around privacy, competition, and taxation. Corporate nations therefore extend beyond services into foundational systems that support entire economies. This transformation blurs the line between private enterprise and public authority, raising questions about accountability in a world where infrastructure is no longer exclusively national. When essential infrastructure moves into corporate ecosystems, dependence becomes a strategic reality, shaping how nations plan their digital future. Taxation and regulation represent another arena, where corporate nations demonstrate influence traditionally associated with sovereign states. Multinational corporations structure operations across multiple jurisdictions, optimizing tax obligations through legal frameworks that exploit differences between national systems. This strategy allows companies to operate globally while minimizing financial friction, but it also challenges governments seeking to maintain stable public revenue. Negotiations between policymakers and corporate leaders increasingly resemble diplomatic discussions rather than standard regulatory processes. Governments compete to attract investment through incentives, creating a landscape where corporations hold significant bargaining power. Some countries adjust labor laws, data policies, or tax rates to remain attractive within global corporate ecosystems. This dynamic echoes historical feudal arrangements, where rulers granted privileges to powerful entities in exchange for economic stability or protection. International organizations attempt to coordinate global tax rules, yet implementation remains complex due to competing national interests. Supporters of corporate mobility argue that flexible tax structures encourage innovation and cross-border growth. Critics warn that excessive competition between countries weakens public institutions by reducing resources available for education, infrastructure, and social services. The challenge lies in balancing competitiveness with fairness. As corporate nations expand, the question shifts from whether corporations should be regulated to how regulation can keep pace with globalized operations. This tension reshapes sovereignty itself, forcing governments to collaborate more closely than ever before. Corporate leaders participate in policy discussions alongside national representatives, highlighting how economic power translates into political influence. Understanding taxation dynamics reveals that corporate nations are not only economic actors, but participants in shaping global governance frameworks. Their ability to navigate multiple legal systems creates a form of strategic autonomy rarely seen in earlier eras. When taxation becomes negotiation rather than obligation, the balance between public authority and private power begins to shift quietly over time. Geopolitical strategy has also evolved alongside the rise of corporate nations, as governments increasingly view large corporations as strategic partners or rivals within global competition. Technology companies play central roles in areas such as artificial intelligence, semiconductor development, and cybersecurity, sectors that shape national security as much as economic growth. Governments collaborate with corporate leaders to secure supply chains, develop new technologies, and maintain competitive advantages against other nations. This partnership blurs traditional boundaries between state policy and private enterprise. Corporate executives participate in diplomatic discussions, influence regulatory standards, and sometimes shape foreign policy priorities through investment decisions. At the same time, tensions emerge when corporate interests conflict with national objectives. Companies operating across multiple countries must balance regulatory expectations that may contradict each other, forcing strategic decisions about data storage, product design, and market access. The comparison to feudalism becomes more complex in this context. Instead of serving a single sovereign, modern corporations navigate a network of alliances and pressures, leveraging their global reach to negotiate favorable outcomes. Governments recognize that restricting corporate power too aggressively could drive innovation elsewhere, creating a delicate balance between control and cooperation. The geopolitical dimension reveals that corporate nations are not isolated actors, but participants in shaping global power structures. Their investments influence infrastructure projects, technological standards, and even diplomatic relationships. Understanding this layer shows how economic influence translates into strategic significance, transforming corporations into entities that operate at the intersection of commerce and geopolitics. As competition between nations intensifies, the role of corporate nations becomes more visible, highlighting both opportunities for collaboration and risks associated with concentrated private power. When corporate strategy begins shaping geopolitics, power shifts from borders toward networks that connect economies across the world. Public perception of corporate nations often swings between admiration and concern, reflecting a broader uncertainty about how much power private institutions should hold in modern society. On one hand, corporations drive technological progress, create jobs, and connect markets in ways that improve efficiency and expand opportunity. Many of the tools people rely on daily, from communication platforms to digital payments, exist because companies invested heavily in innovation long before governments could adapt. On the other hand, the growing concentration of influence raises fears about accountability and inequality. When a small number of firms dominate entire sectors, their decisions can shape wages, competition, and even political discourse without direct democratic oversight. This tension fuels debates about antitrust regulation, data privacy, and digital rights. Citizens increasingly question whether platforms should operate purely as private businesses or carry responsibilities similar to public institutions. Social movements and policy reforms across different regions reflect this shift in awareness. Younger generations, in particular, view corporate power through a lens shaped by gig work, online communities, and algorithm-driven economies. The narrative surrounding corporate nations therefore evolves constantly, shaped by cultural values as much as economic realities. Companies attempt to balance innovation with public trust, introducing transparency initiatives and ethical guidelines to address criticism, yet skepticism persists, especially when controversies highlight gaps between corporate promises and real-world outcomes. Understanding public perception is essential because legitimacy determines long-term stability. Power that appears beneficial today may face resistance tomorrow if trust erodes. Corporate nations thrive when users feel empowered rather than controlled. Maintaining that balance requires continuous adaptation, not only in technology, but in governance models that reflect changing expectations across societies. The future of corporate nations may depend less on innovation itself and more on whether trust keeps pace with expanding influence. As corporate nations expand, debates about regulation increasingly focus on how to preserve innovation while preventing excessive concentration of power. Governments around the world are experimenting with new legal frameworks designed to address digital monopolies, data ownership, and cross-border platform influence. Some regions introduce stricter competition laws to limit market dominance, while others prioritize open markets to attract investment. This fragmented regulatory landscape creates challenges for both policymakers and corporations. Companies must adapt to multiple legal systems simultaneously, often redesigning products or services to comply with regional rules. Meanwhile, governments struggle to coordinate responses to entities that operate globally but are regulated locally. International cooperation is slowly emerging through agreements on digital taxation, privacy standards, and antitrust enforcement, yet consensus remains difficult. Supporters of strong regulation argue that corporate nations require oversight comparable to public institutions because their decisions affect billions of people. Critics caution that excessive regulation could slow innovation and reduce global competitiveness. The tension between control and growth defines much of today's policy debate. Historical parallels to feudalism highlight how concentrated power can shape societies if left unchecked, but modern systems also offer tools for transparency and accountability that did not exist in earlier eras. Public awareness plays a key role in shaping regulatory outcomes as citizens demand clearer rules around data use and platform governance. The evolution of corporate nations therefore depends not only on corporate strategy, but on how societies redefine the relationship between public authority and private influence. Finding balance requires acknowledging that traditional regulatory models may no longer fit an interconnected digital economy. The real challenge is not stopping corporate nations from growing, but deciding what kind of rules can guide power without slowing progress. In the end, the rise of corporate nations does not signal the disappearance of traditional states, but rather a transformation in how power is distributed across modern society. Governments still control laws, borders, and public institutions, yet corporations increasingly shape the systems through which people communicate, work, and exchange value. This overlap creates a hybrid landscape where authority is shared rather than absolute. Some analysts describe this shift as feudalism 2.0 because influence flows through networks of dependency rather than territorial control. Platforms provide infrastructure, opportunity, and protection, while users contribute data, labor, and loyalty in return. Unlike medieval feudalism, participation remains voluntary, yet the scale of reliance makes opting out increasingly difficult. The future of the system will likely depend on how societies balance innovation with accountability. Corporate nations may continue driving technological advancement and economic integration, but long-term stability requires trust between companies, governments, and citizens. Transparent governance models, fair competition rules, and ethical use of data could shape how this balance evolves. Without these safeguards, concentration of power risks undermining the very innovation that made corporate nations successful in the first place. The question is not whether corporations will remain influential, but how their role will be defined in a world where digital infrastructure becomes as essential as physical infrastructure once was. Understanding this transformation helps clarify that modern power no longer fits traditional categories. Nations and corporations are becoming interconnected actors within a shared global system. The story of corporate nations is therefore less about replacing governments and more about redefining the boundaries of authority in an increasingly networked world where influence flows through systems rather than borders. The future may not belong to nations or corporations alone, but to whoever learns to control the networks that connect them both.